Just give you one basic premise that allows the government to legally limit speech that I think you should be aware of. I'm one of the biggest free speech advocates. I think it is the backbone of any free society to be able to criticize your government. Now, as a lawyer, I took First Amendment law while I was in law school, and I found it very fascinating. I'm not going to get into the entire panoply of free speech, First Amendment jurisprudence with you on this video. What the Founding Fathers did is a truly remarkable thing. Speech. Our First Amendment right to free speech is not absolute. Things like obscene content are still illegal in the United States. 10,000 years of human civilization in which you can find very little instances of even a consideration of free speech. And welcome back to the Contemporary Happiness Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the art and science of personal joy. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the history and legal limitations on free speech. Now, this is related to my entire thesis on how you got to think critically. With all the fervor that's surrounding the protests happening on college campuses right now, I thought it is a good idea to look into the history and legal limitations of free speech. Let's first begin by quickly describing what is free speech law. The free speech law, which is under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, states that no government can create a law that prohibits speech. So that basically means that the government cannot restrict any type of speech. The free speech law was designed primarily to allow citizens, people, the average person, to criticize the government. Okay? Before the First Amendment, in many countries around the world, if you criticized the government, you could be arrested. You could be subject to punishment. So that's what free speech law is. It's a law that prohibits the government from creating any type of law that prevents you from making certain type of speech. When I was researching this podcast, I thought let me quickly research the history of free speech throughout human civilization. And if you look into the history of free speech, there really wasn't that much free speech until the United States was invented and basically invented the notion of free speech. The only types of laws historically before the creation of the United States that protected speech are found in ancient Greece during the Socrates and the Plato days, where the notion of a democratic society was first being introduced to human civilization. And they had some laws on the books that protected free speech, designed to encourage open discourse and open discussion about topics related to the government. So there was a little bit of history. Historically, there has been a little bit of free speech law, primarily in ancient Greece. But when we're talking 500 BC, for example, right? Fast forward to the 1600s, and the United Kingdom created a parliamentary privilege law. And this allowed the members of the parliament, that means the government, to openly discuss issues within Parliament and not be afraid of getting sued or getting punished by any type of government entity. So there was what's called the Parliamentary Privilege Law in the United Kingdom or in England in the 1600s, and it did not apply to commoners. It did not apply to the average citizen. It was only a very limited free speech law that was designed to only apply to discussions that were happening within the chambers of Parliament during official government business. Right? Again, to encourage people to have open discussion about topics that were related to the government. So then you have, the The Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Constitution, the United States Constitution, becoming the law of the United States shortly after that. And the founding fathers were the first people that truly invented the notion of free speech. They put it first. They put it the first law of their Constitution, right? The First Amendment protects free speech. So in my opinion, America practically invented free speech. There was really no free speech before the invention of the United States. France also happened to adopt some free speech laws during the French Revolution in the late 1700s, around the same time that America was adopting its free speech laws. But I think it's fascinating to consider that throughout human civilization, let's say the last 10,000 years, there's been so many types of governments and kings that have ruled people. And it wasn't until 1776 or the 1780s where free speech actually became the law of the land in the United States. Of course, even now in 2024, there's a lot of countries that still don't have free speech laws, right? And I think that's something very noteworthy to consider, that where we've been and how far we've come and how much more we have to go to be able to really enjoy free speech worldwide. So now I want to talk to you about the legal limitations on free speech. Now, as a lawyer, I took First Amendment law while I was in law school, and I found it very fascinating. And I'm not going to get into the entire panoply of free speech, First Amendment jurisprudence with you on this video, but you're welcome to research that, ask Google, ask ChatGPT to explain it to you. But let me just give you one basic premise that allows the government to legally limit speech that I think you should be aware of. And that's what's called the time, place, and manner restriction. Okay, TPM, the time, place, and manner restriction. What the time, place, and manner restriction means, it means that when the government is allowed to limit your speech, but not based on what you're saying, right? Just because the government doesn't like what you're saying, doesn't like the subject of your speech, it still can't limit you just based on that. But it can limit the time, place, and manner in which you engage in free speech. This time, place, and manner restriction comes from a famous Supreme Court case in the United States in the 1940s, where a local government, like a city government, for example, was forcing protesters to get a permit before going on their protest. Okay, so the government had a rule, the local government had a rule that stated that you must have a permit to go on a protest. And the permit process had a fee attached to it. So not only do you have to get the permit, but you also have to pay a fee to get the permit. And of course, the people that wanted to go on the protest, they challenged this law. They challenged it, and they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court stated that the government has a legitimate interest in protecting public safety, and therefore it is allowed to require a permit before a protest takes place within the town limits. And the rationale here is that the government, the town government where the protest was going to happen, has an obligation, like I said, to maintain public safety. They have to make preparations for the protest that's happening, whether it's putting up barricades, adding more police to the force, any type of preparations that are reasonable to prepare for a large protest or demonstration. The government is well within its rights to, want to have advance notice of this protest going on so that it can make the necessary preparations. Also, the fee that was attached to the permitting process was deemed to be valid so long as the fee is reasonable and it's not designed to be prohibitive to prevent you from getting the permit so that you can have your demonstration or your protest. So this court ruling established what's called the time, place, and manner restriction. And what that means is that the government cannot restrict your speech based on the content of your speech, but it can restrict your speech based on the time, the place, and the manner in which you engage in that free speech. A clear example of this is the law that prohibits you from yelling fire in a crowded theater when there's actually no fire, right? You have a freedom of speech. You have the freedom to yell fire wherever you want. But of course, we all know that if somebody yells fire in a crowded theater, there's a high likelihood that people are going to rush to the exits. People might get injured during the rush to get out of the theater, right? And if there was an actual fire, then that's fine. You're well within your rights to warn everybody about a fire. But if there is no fire and you just, make this declaration that there's a fire in the theater, then you have broken the law. So that's, I think, a good example of the time, place, and manner restriction, right? Which means that you can yell fire, but if you're in a crowded space, you cannot yell fire if there is no fire, right? At that time that you yelled fire, there was no fire. Therefore, the time restriction on your ability to yell fire is valid. At that place where you yelled fire in the theater, there was no fire. And therefore, the limitation on your ability to yell fire in a crowded theater is valid. So I think you're well advised to consider what's called the time, place, and manner restriction on free speech. Our First Amendment right to free speech is not absolute. Things like obscene content are still illegal in the United States. Things like child pornography are still illegal in the United States. Things like copyright infringement is still illegal in the United States. So these are what's called reasonable limitations on the freedom of speech. And I think it's important to consider that because I am one of the biggest free speech advocates. I think it is the backbone of any free society to be able to criticize your government. And that's primarily why I have personal issues with some of the governments in the international community that don't allow free speech. It's obvious why they don't allow free speech. It's because they don't want their citizens to criticize the government. What the founding fathers did is a truly, truly remarkable thing by allowing the citizens, the average citizens, right, to be able to criticize the government in open space, in open public space. I mean, that is a truly revolutionary idea when you consider the prior 10,000 years of human civilization in which you can find very little instances of even a consideration of free speech. So that's my message to you today, and I hope that it's something that's informative to you. Let me know what you think about the time, place, and manner restriction on free speech. This is David Nima, host of the Contemporary Happiness Podcast, and I'll see you all in the next episode.